Hi, everyone. My name is Drew Sawyer, and I'm a senior sport management major originally from Wichita Falls, Texas. And I'm the public relations officer here at UT. And I'm honored to be part of this amazing event tonight. Our first panel today is on diversity in the sports industry, and we'd like to thank the UT Austin Division of Diversity and Community Engagement for co-representing this panel. Our moderator today is Dr. Darren Kelly. He's an associate vice president in the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement and is an assistant professor of instruction in sport management. We're so grateful to Dr. Kelly and all of our panelists for taking the time to join us today. We'd like to remind y'all that if you have any questions, the Q&A and the chat features are available for y'all. So for questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window so that the moderators can see your questions. And then we also encourage y'all to share your thoughts and reactions on social media using our hashtag, that is hashtag #PlayLong with a capital P and a capital L. Thank you.
All right, good evening, and thank you, Drew. We appreciate the introduction and getting us started today. Again, I'm Darren Kelly. I am the moderator for this panel, and I'm here to really generate the conversation and get out of the way because we have some excellent panelists here joining us today, and I'm really excited about this topic and this panel that we're going to be having as part of our conference here, the Playing the Long Game Symposium. So really, we're focusing today on diversity in sport, and certainly I think it's no surprise that, again, diversity continues to be in the forefront of our minds, especially when we think about the sport industry, right? If we look at the recent happenings and what's been going on in not only the sports world, but certainly in our larger society, we know that there are issues that we face in sport organizations when it comes to understanding the need for diversity, the business case for it, and the moral case as well. Certainly, even recent events such as George Floyd's murder from last year, as well as even the recent killing of Daunte Wright, has really brought home some of these major issues into the discussion when it comes to thinking about not only just diversity in sport, but really thinking about, again, the larger social issues in the sports world's role in addressing these issues and speaking out and providing voice to these issues. So I'm really excited to really talk about some of these key issues here, to really focus not only just on, again, the experience, but also the practices as well as the policies that really help us to really generate and drive diversity initiatives in the sports organizations and sport leagues that a lot of our panelists are been a part of and working currently. So right now I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll go ahead and get right into the conversation. And again, we're joined by some excellent panelists, and I'm excited to have them as part of the conversation. The first one I'd like to introduce is Swin Cash-Canal. She serves currently as the Vice President of Basketball Operations and Team Development for the New Orleans Pelicans. But certainly even prior to her career in the front office, she had an excellent playing career at all levels, a Hall of Fame worthy career, a Hall of Fame career that she was just inducted in last year, I believe. And she was selected #2 overall by Detroit in the 2002 WNBA draft out of UConn, former Husky. She had a 15-year WNBA career, a 3-time WNBA champion, also leading the U.S. women's national team to 2 Olympic gold medals. But again, one of the things that she's really been doing is taking her post-playing career to really high levels when it comes to being involved in the front office and involved in basketball. So she remained with the New York Liberty, assumed its first of its kind WNBA front office position as Director of Franchise Development. She also then went into sports media and media outlets, working with Turner Sports, CBS Sports, and the MSG Network. I actually had a great opportunity to meet her at the Final Four in 2019, where my University of Virginia Wahoos won the NCAA National Championship. She was working for CBS College Sports there, covering the Final Four. She's not only just great in the office, but certainly has done a lot of work in public service. She has her own company that's really called Cash Building Blocks, focusing on renovating and creating affordable homes and opportunities for low-income families. But just a great individual, really doing a lot of great work in the field. I want to welcome Swin Cash-Canal.
Thanks, Darren. I appreciate being here and honored to be on this panel with all of you.
Thank you, Swin. Our next panelist is Dr. LaToya Smith. She is the Vice President for Diversity and Community Engagement at the University of Texas at Austin. She previously served as a Senior Associate Director for Student Services in Texas Athletics, providing strategic leadership over academic and student services in intercollegiate athletics, and establishing one of the strongest student support networks in all of college athletics. And she also serves currently as a faculty member in the Educational Leadership and Policy Department in the College of Education, teaching higher education law and student affairs in higher education. She is a two-time Texas Ex, and she even took a break to go get a degree from Texas Tech, getting her master's before coming back to get her PhD here from the University of Texas. And again, with an illustrious career working in higher education and college athletics, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Smith to really kind of talk about a lot of the issues that we're seeing on the intercollegiate level. So I'd like to welcome Dr. LaToya Smith.
Thank you. It's an honor and a privilege to be with such an esteemed panel. So thanks for having me.
Our next panelist is Sam Rapoport. Sam is the Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with the National Football League. She has a dedicated her career to creating innovative business models aimed at enfranchising marginalized populations in sport. With this focus, she has worked to shift and progress diversity hiring practices in football. I credit Rapoport really catalyzing the movement for women in sports by creating a new diversity platform in the NFL that has since been replicated by other professional sports leagues. Through this effort, over 100 female coaching, scouting, and operations candidates have been hired in the 4-year period, a record number. She's had a great career working within USA Football as well as the Women's World Football Games. Has been named as one of the most outstanding women in sports, and even included in the athletics NFL 40 under 40. I want to welcome Sam Rapoport to the panel.
Thank you all. Excited to be here.
And last but certainly not least, I'd like to welcome Professor Jeremi Duru. Dr. Duru, or Professor Duru, teaches sports law, civil procedure, and employment discrimination, and he is among the nation's foremost sports law authorities. He's also been author of one of the field's premier case books, Sports Law and Regulation, Cases and Materials, as well as one of the field's premier explorations of sports agency, the business of sports agents. So again, a lot of our students who are here today who are interested in being a sport agent, going to sport agency, understanding sport law, Dr. Duru is one of the foremost experts in this, and certainly one to know of as you progress in your career. He's active in the national sports law community, serving on the member of the USADA's Anti-Doping Review Board, the NCAA's Committee on Competitive Safeguards and Medical Aspects of Sports. He's also consulted and been an advocate working with different groups focused on sports, society, and racial and gender dynamics with the Fritz Pollard Alliance of Minority Coaches, Scouts, and front office personnel in the NFL, as well as sport industry professionals and employment matters involving other leagues, including the NBA and Major League Baseball. He's widely recognized for his excellence as both an advocate and a teacher, has been awarded numerous awards from a number of associations and industries. Let's welcome Jeremi Duru to the panel.
Thank you, Darren. Real honored to be on this panel. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. And Jeremi, since I left off with your bio, we're going to go ahead and launch into the panel. And my first question is going to be to you.
Sure.
So the first one I want to kick off our panel with is the Rooney Rule, right? And certainly we've heard about the Rooney Rule. A lot of us are familiar with it in terms of its impact. Some of us may not be as familiar with some of the inner workings of it and what it actually entails. So, I mean, this is one of the most recognizable efforts to improve diversity and increase hiring of African Americans and people of color in the head coaching roles and front office positions in major sports. In fact, plenty of other industries have actually looked into or actually implemented Rooney rules for their respective organizations, including the University of Texas system. So can you discuss the history of the Rooney Rule, how it came to be implemented, and discuss the challenges and successes of the rule?
Sure. Thanks again, Darren. So I think to discuss the Rooney Rule, we have to contextualize it in the conversation about race and racial inequity in the NFL generally, because there's a long history of that. So going back to the beginning of the last century, when the NFL was just starting, there actually were people of color in the league, someone named Fritz Pollard, who was a great player as well as a great coach, Hall of Fame coach in the league, 1920, 21, 22. Few Black players, not a lot. In the years that followed, all people of color were expurgated from the league and not allowed back in until the mid-1940s, 1946. And when they were allowed back in, they were allowed in trickles and into certain positions. So you didn't see a quarterback who was Black until the 1960s. You had Blacks playing positions that are deemed the brawn positions and not deemed the quote unquote brain positions. So it shouldn't be a surprise that when you think about the quote unquote brainiest position on the football field, the coach, you saw no African Americans in that position until 1989, when you had Art Shell getting the job. So between 1921, Fritz Pollard, and 1989 with Art Shell getting a job with the Raiders. People thought that that was going to open the floodgates for all the Black coaches working as assistants doing great work, but it really didn't. A decade later, in 2001, after that season, Tony Dungy, who was with the Buccaneers, was fired. Dennis Green, who was with the Minnesota Vikings, was fired, and you had one black head coach out of 32 in a league where 70% of the players were black. So that's the context that we have to think about when we think about the Rooney Rule. So at that moment, lawyers, employment discrimination lawyers, became upset. They saw what was going on in the league. They saw that there seemed to be this glass ceiling for coaches of color, and they ran a report. They studied head coaching records over the last 15 years. So from 2001 back to 86, compared by race, and found the black coaches in their first year in the job won 2.7 more games than non-black coaches in a 16-game NFL season. So that's a huge number, huge statistical significance. In the year of termination, black coaches won 1.5 more games per year. So black coaches were doing better, but they were having fewer opportunities. And so the conclusion of the study was not that black coaches are innately better coaches. It was that they've been forced into subordinate roles on coaching staffs for so long. They had so much experience. When they got to the head coaching spot, they did really well. So these lawyers took the report, essentially threatened the National Football League, sent them a copy of it and said, this is a real problem, you've got to do something. So the league, unbeknownst to these lawyers, had been worried about this issue internally. And foremost among those worried within the league was Dan Rooney with the Pittsburgh Steelers. He'd been focusing on diversity efforts with the Steelers for years. And so when the league heard about this report, heard about the concern, they put together a committee. Dan Rooney chaired it, called the Workplace Diversity Committee. And that committee engaged with these lawyers, who also were working at the time with Kellen Winslow Sr., Warren Moon, some other NFL greats, to talk about what to do. And what came out of that conversation about what to do to increase equity for coaches of color was this thing called a fair competition resolution, which would be that for any head coaching job you're seeking to fill, you have to interview at least one person of color. Dan Rooney was the chief architect and initiator inside the league of the idea. And so when all 32 clubs agreed, it became known as the Rooney Rule. So the Rooney Rule took effect in 2003. It's had a speckled career since then, history since then. I mean, there have been times when numbers have been way up, times when they've been down. It's had some successes. And there have been some failures in the way that the league has implemented it. I think at core, it is a wonderful initiative to try to increase diversity. But if you don't have enforcement, and that sometimes the league hasn't enforced failures to implement it, then you can have pullback. And I think right now we are in a period of unfortunate pullback.
So that pullback that you mentioned, right? And I think you were kind of going through it and seeing it. And some people would even point to the situation of coaches like Eric Bieniemy, right? I mean, we're seeing that it seems like African-American coaches, especially when they get the opportunities, they're also brought in to kind of do these major cleanup jobs. And sometimes there's also frustration when it comes to the actual qualifications or qualities that they're looking for in head coaches. So how would you address that in terms of does it seem to be, how do you address this frustration and kind of this melees in terms of progress, and what do we need to do to kind of make sure that we're getting back on track when it comes to hiring practices?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's difficult and somewhat painful, Darren, to address, because you have folks like Eric Bieniemy, who clearly could do the job, who have done the job as offensive coordinator, who have done it for Coach Andy Reid, whose previous offensive coordinators have gone off to head coaching jobs. Bieniemy is the first one to win the Super Bowl as the OC there. He's not getting the opportunity, and it's not just Bieniemy, there are others as well. And the bottom line, I think there are two problems, Darren. One, I think the league relied too long on just the Rooney Rule. It's a very important rule. It's, as you've indicated, it's gone and influenced other industries in this country and abroad. But never can we in the civil rights community rely on one initiative. We've always got to have multiples. And so one, I think there haven't been the multiples. And two, with respect to the Rooney Rule, we just haven't seen it effectuated in the manner it should be. There have been multiple situations where there's been an interview of a head coach candidate, and it's clearly been a sham. It's been obvious that that individual was not considered. If in those moments, the league brought the hammer down and said, this is a failure to effectuate the rule, there will be a punishment, then I think we have a different scenario. But the league hasn't historically done that, not since 2003. And consequently, I think some clubs have kind of taken the view, well, the league isn't really enforcing this. Maybe they're not that serious about the rule. And so we've had some of the pullback. With that said, the league last spring implemented a new set of initiatives around the Rooney Rule. We saw mixed success this hiring season. Didn't see much success on the head coach level. We did see success on the general manager level. But we'll see what the league does going forward to ensure that its new initiatives are adhered to by the clubs.
All right, now I want to transition a little bit into more so gender diversity, especially when we look at the NFL. And certainly while we talk about the Rooney Rule and really championing things for people of color, I think there are certainly some strides and some issues and challenges that we're seeing when it comes to increasing gender diversity in the sport of football. So I'm coming over to you, Sam. And really my question to you is, I mean, obviously we've seen this past Super Bowl featuring teams with 2 full-time female coaches, a female scout and scouting assistant, the most senior Black female in operations role with the Bucks, 2 full-time trainers with the Chiefs, and a female official. So, I mean, how did the NFL and these 2 teams get here? And certainly, I think you've played a major role in that. So what are the initiatives that are being done to help improve the numbers on these teams, and how can we do that for other teams?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Kelly. So, we looked at the NFL 6 years ago and saw that there were no female coaches, very few female scouts, and young girls and women were not aspiring to these positions because they never believed that they were for them. And so we made a concerted effort under the leadership of Troy Vincent, really, to create programming to enfranchise a group of people that happened to be women that were completely disenfranchised from traditional football roles like coaching and scouting, what have you. So we created a program in 2017 called the NFL Women's Careers in Football Forum. And through that, we take a group of 40 women every year who are in entry level football positions at college football in Division I typically. And we put them in a room for 2 days at Combine with our head coaches, our general managers, our owners, and we give them the floor to impress these people to potentially get on short lists for hiring. And what we've seen from that program now is over 130 opportunities have emerged from the program. And we now have 8 full season female coaches, 11 female scouts, and the numbers in other areas of football operations continue to grow. So really the premise is just get the group of people in the room with folks who they normally wouldn't interact with, right? Because the number one thing we hear from head coaches is, I don't know where to find them. So that excuse has been taken away because they're right here.
Just to follow up briefly on that, what does a pipeline look like for women who are interested in moving up in the football world, right? I mean, I think we've seen some women's professional leagues. Certainly the one that gets the most unfortunate notoriety is things like the LFL, but certainly there are very much well-established women's professional football leagues, semi-professional leagues, and other opportunities being created for young women in sports. So what does the pipeline look like in terms of not only getting into the experience prior to working in the NFL or even the college ranks? And so what does that pipeline look like?
Yeah, so the LFL really is it's a gimmick league, right? That's not real football. And so real football is women playing in pads with the same rules that men are playing with. And there are I think over 120 female tackle football teams in the country right now. And they're one of our best pipelines, right? And so we look there, we look at women who are currently in recruiting roles, scouting roles at the college level. And to find our female coaches, in football, it's difficult because we don't have, the W or, professional softball or other leagues to lean on. So what we do is we really scour the internet for media articles about high school coaches, college coaches, anyone who may be, coaching football at any level who would qualify for this program. And it takes us a full year to find those 40. That's how much work we put in to making sure that the right people are in the room, because whether it's just or not, and it's not, we know that the first woman has to succeed, because if she doesn't, the mentality will be, well, women don't belong, right? And so it's critically important for us to make sure that we have the right 40 women in the room, and we've had some success in that in the 5 years of the program.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. And right now it's Jackie Robinson Day, right? We're recognizing his contribution 74 years ago. And like you said, having to be one of the first, right? All the pressure is on you to make sure that they can still reach back and continue to open the door for the ones coming behind you. And so always having to be the best of the best in terms of the way you conduct yourself and carry yourself, but also the way you play and the way you perform. So I think we see that on multiple fronts, and not only just in the sport of football, but even in the sport of basketball. And so I want to turn to you, Swin. You had a excellent, obviously Hall of Fame career as a basketball player at all levels. And so, but you've been doing some amazing work in both media and the front offices of the WNBA and NBA franchises. So how are you able to make that transition from player to media personality to VP of basketball operations for the Pelicans? And also, what were some of the challenges that you faced, especially being a Black woman in many of these roles?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I come into this role from a very unique perspective, right? A lot of times people who, if you look across the league and the 30 teams, people who are in executive roles, a lot of them have worked their way up somehow, right? They may have started as an intern, they've been in the video room, they've done this, they've done that to kind of get to the top. Whereas I was playing, but I also had exposure to every element of our business, right? And so I worked in the media. I covered the NBA. So I understood from that perspective and that lens what it was about. As a player, I also worked with the executive committee, and I went through 2 CBA negotiations, which I truly hope I never have to go through again. But understanding and having to read a CBA from front to back, not having a background as an attorney, but teaching and learning as you're going through it, as you're negotiating for these contracts. And then having perspective as a woman and as a Black woman playing in the WNBA, understanding what we stood for, where the inequities were within, not only in the league, but in our society, and how we could use sports as something that motivates and can bring us to that equal and equality level we wanted to be at. And so when I met kind of my boss, David Griffin, it was during TV. And we had a quick conversation. We were talking about players, and I was telling him how I looked at players and what I thought of some of the college kids that were coming out. And more of the story is, as I was leaving out, he just said to me, "Hey, I'm interviewing for a few jobs. If I get one of these jobs, I'm gonna call you." And I was like, "Okay, bye." Like, didn't think twice about it. It wasn't one of those things where I was out there looking for a job. And so fast forward to me being here after he hired me and having a conversation, and it really just came down to, he wanted to have forward thinking. He wanted to have not only people in the room that was diverse, but had diverse backgrounds and thought. And so one of my challenges, you asked the question about my challenge. The challenge is that when you sit in that room, regardless of how like human nature is, like, I love everybody, I'm nice to everyone. But when you sit across from people maybe who have had a different journey than you have, it's almost like the challenge of, well, what do you know versus what I know? I've been here longer than you. You're on the WNBA side. The women are different than the men. And for me, basketball is basketball, how we're evaluating. But I may have something different that they don't have, which is the playing experience. So there's those challenges all the time of coming into a situation where they're looking at you as not going through what they've gone through. So are you truly in this position as just a figurehead as a woman, or can you do the work? So there's a challenge there. And then the second part of that is now having to every day come in and sit in, whether it's a war room, trade negotiations. There's sometimes you're not going to be exposed to the mechanisms of how things work, but that doesn't mean you can't do the work. And I think that's why you've seen stories come out recently with players saying, look, we need more ex-players to have those executive roles. And they've been shut out from them for a really, really long time. Is that players can be coaches, but getting in that chair, making a decision. Right now in the NBA, we have 8 general managers that are African-American. Can we continue to do better? Absolutely. But now the focus is on the executive side. How many executives do we have in that front office that are making decisions? And I think there's a challenge that's there, but I think the NBA as a whole has been very progressive in how they've approached it. And there's still a lot of work to be done.
Considering the pipeline and really, where a lot of our folks are coming from and our future sport leaders, right? We're training them in a lot of our colleges and universities, and especially right here at the University of Texas with our sport management program. So I really want to pivot in how we look at the college life and the college atmosphere and the intercollegiate experience to see what is going on when it comes to diversity and equity issues. So, I want to pivot to Dr. Smith. You've worked in higher education for, almost close to 20 years, I believe, and working in college athletics, but also in student affairs, and now in the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. You've had a really broad and great experiences that have really shaped in terms of your views and at least what some of the challenges are when it comes to diversity and equity issues on college campuses and with college athletes. So can you talk about, what are some of those issues that we're seeing at the collegiate level and what we're seeing not only just from a student perspective, but also when it comes to, again, working in college athletics and also even in staff and faculty? What are some of the things that we're seeing on at the college level?
Yeah, thanks, Darren. And let me first preface that I do not claim to be a college student athlete. While I did play basketball, I was never good enough to be at the D1 level. But most of my career in some way, form, or fashion has been connected to student athletes. And sadly, I think some of the same things I saw earlier in my career are still some of the challenges that our student athletes are having to face. I was having a conversation with a colleague a couple of weeks ago about the visualization of how Asian and Asian American students are represented in higher education. And I really thought it translated well to, and I'm going to focus on Black student athletes for right now, but this pyramid where, especially in our revenue sports, African American and Black student athletes are really at the base and the bottom. But as you continue to move up this pyramid, there's just less representation. And it made me start really thinking about how do we change that shape from a pyramid to a rectangle, to where from the bottom there is continued representation, all the way to the top. And I think part of that, as a lot of the panelists have said, is about being able to not only see somebody in that chair, but and I believe that when you can see them, you can be them. And so oftentimes a lot of in collegiate athletics, you had so many student athletes, at least this is what I saw and observed, was that the fact that I was sitting in the chair absolutely made a difference in whether they felt like they could access things, ask questions. I think their self-advocacy. I think one of the things that's really important, and I want to demystify this conception of the Black student athlete experience, because I think that sometimes poses some challenges. Let me first say that I do think that there are commonalities, and it's with marginalized groups, especially in athletics, the feeling of isolation, feeling erased, missing, unheard, in some ways dehumanized. All of those things absolutely are commonalities that research has shown, that students speak about, that faculty and staff and administrators talk about in various different ways. But the one things that students have taught me in my time in working in athletics is that there is not a monolithic experience, right? So the way that an African-American student from Katy, Texas, outside of Houston, is going on the football team, is going to transition and access the university, is going to look very different from a Jamaican female on the women's track team. And so when we try to create this, this is the Black experience, we are missing out on that intersectionality. And I think that oftentimes we want to put our students in this box or this frame of, this is what they need, this is who they are. And we often erase the multiple identities, or we're solely focusing on the athleticism and not thinking about their race, their gender, religion, spirituality, their sexual identity, all of those aspects, which I think is why some of the challenges of dealing with diversity, equity, and belonging in collegiate athletics. And so I think, we have to prioritize it, which is part of the challenge. I don't always feel like collegiate athletics prioritizes diversity, equity, and belonging. I think when it's prioritized, you think about who's at your table and the dangers of when you're not equity minded. Sorry, Darren, it's a really bad storm. So there's hail hitting. So if you lose me,
I got it too.
I'm slightly distracted. But, as I was saying, I think it really goes into what is we know what the benefits are when you have diverse opinions, thoughts, backgrounds. Teams analyze things better, more effectively, more efficiently. But what I'm finding, or what I found, was that you tend to hire who you know. And when everybody at the top is white or male or from a certain background, that's who you hire, that's who you connect with. And so when you look around and you're like, well, I don't see other people that look like me, especially when you're at the bottom, you don't feel like you have access to those chairs and to those positions. So, I think my time in collegiate athletics especially really taught me where the dangers and the deficits and the negative impact of not having diversity has on our students, especially our student athletes, how they're marketed, how they interact, and we have them interact with alumni and donors and boosters, coaching, the kind of supports that we provide them. When we don't have that diverse thought and focus, I think we end up erasing their experience and who they are.
Great. No.
And
Let me-
Darren, if I could just add
Go
to
ahead.
that real quick, I just wanted to add to that because I thought LaToya did an excellent job of really hitting on those different things that the students struggle with or that she sees, but I obviously too felt in college, is you also you have to hire coaches that are willing to do the work if they don't have that exposure to diversity and inclusion, what that means, what that feels like. You know, it's easy for these coaches to go into homes and tell moms and dads that, hey, I'm gonna bring your child in, they're gonna be part of my family. Well, if you're gonna bring them in and be part of the family, then you have to be doing the work, you know what I'm saying, as a family member to take care of that family. And I think a lot of times, like, there's so much, we talk about these coaches that have these huge contracts, and yes, you want to pay your coaches. You look at their staff and it's like, oh, they have some diversity on their staff, but they're not taking any training. They're not trying to understand and meet these kids where they are. It's literally, to me, it's really insulting that there's not kind of a widespread kind of, whether it's the Rooney Rule, whether there is a different rule that's out there, but there should be training for every single head coach and their staff when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Because of, just in general, the diversity of the student athletes that you are bringing to these universities. I think it's just so important. That's why you hear sometimes coaches that come out and speak out of turn when things are happening in our society, and they bring it back to sport, but they have a student that's crying in the dorm room who is emotionally traumatized and dealing with things, but they have no clue because they're in their own box and they haven't extended themselves to learn more. So I just wanted to, that's my soapbox that I get on sometimes, but we have to do more in that space because they have 4 years, a lot of times, especially with female athletes. We're in college a longer period of time than some other athletes, but you have to invest. It's important.
Yeah, and so coming along those lines and following up to both what Swin and both LaToya was talking about when it comes to our student athletes and their experience, you know, one of the things I think that we've noticed and we've seen in recent years, especially as more and more of our student athletes are feeling passionate and emboldened to speak their minds and really speak out when it comes to supporting social issues and making sure that people understand the experiences they've had with racism in this country. Some of the things we've seen is that we've seen conflict between student athletes as well as our alumni bases or our fans, where they don't have those same opinions. How do you help student athletes and how do you help even our professional athletes navigate some of those conflicts that they often have with their own fan bases, alumni, and even fellow students? And this is for LaToya or Swin or anybody.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that's always sometimes a rough question, but I think that sometimes goes back to what Swin is saying. If you haven't done the work, then I don't think you've put in the trust to help them navigate and guide students when they are being their authentic selves and they are and saying, this is how I feel, this is the stand that I'm going to take. And they're feeling the consequences that come out of that. Because I think it does take a strong sense of self. I think it takes a strong sense of your own cultural identity. Say, you know, this is how I feel about this. I'm going to say this regardless of the consequences and being prepared for those consequences. And so, you know, I think the other thing that's important as we continue to help and support those students when they put themselves out there is, you know, we've had to deal with this a lot, you know, alumni and donors and fan base and, you know, that have made statements that have been disrespectful, harmful, threatening to our student athletes. And it's like, what are we going to do as an institution? Are we going to take a stand? And I think, you know, my dad used to always say in dominoes, not all money is good money, right? And so we really need to decide, are we willing to take the strings that come along with that money and really think about even some of the coaching that we need to do in the education with our alumni and our donors. I think there are a lot of fans and alumni and donors who are really focused on supporting the education and not the entertainment. But oftentimes we hear about the donors who are just about the entertainment. And I would love to kind of pivot to really focusing on cultivating those donors who are about the students' education and about who they are and their development, instead of just running after the ones who are about the entertainment and the money. So I think that's one thing collegiate athletics can do, as I said earlier, understanding when all money's not good money.
Sam, let me transition. I mean, you are obviously you're one of the hottest names out there. You've been incredibly talented, working and really pushing for, for women to move forward within the world of pro football and football in general. And so you also identify you're an out gay woman who is working in professional football. So how have you been able to really navigate the sports world and football in particular? And how have you overcome challenges that you might have faced due to your gender and your sexuality?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dr. Kelly. I think I was the second person to come out in the NFL, and that's all the offices of anyone. And so, we were really late with kind of, creating a welcoming environment for people to feel comfortable to be themselves at the NFL. But I have to give credit to leadership that prioritized it and really made it, gave it the culture that we have now, where, I hope everyone who identifies within the LGBTQ plus community is out. But it was, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was treacherous when I was younger. I grew up at the NFL. I've spent half my life there. I'm 40 now, and I started when I was 22. So it was very painful to try to hide myself all the time and avoid all social situations. I never went to Christmas parties. I never did the summer outing because I always never wanted to be asked any questions. And so it was very challenging. But now I really take it upon myself to help younger folks at the league office who have confided in me that they want to come out, and is it safe to come out, and it's something that I feel very, very passionate about kind of passing down to the next generation.
How would you, just to follow up, so I'm sure we have students who identify in both areas, right? And I think you have other folks who might be a part of the community. How would you encourage them to make that transition and to move into sports and work in the sports world when dealing with all this pressure and challenges to kind of conform to this one frame of mind?
Yeah, it's tough. Not to use a lame football analogy, but you really need to find a lead blocker. Is like the way that I use it. In my personal life, my sister was my lead blocker, and I made her, knock down a bunch of barriers before I was ready to tell my parents. And I really needed that in the office too. And I had someone who was my lead blocker who, I remember when the first person came out, she texted me immediately saying, "You're not going to believe it. You don't have to be the first. She just came out," and she was really helpful in helping me feel more comfortable and kind of, I stood by her at all of the Christmas parties and things like that, just because I was very sensitive to it when I first came out. And now, I try to lead block for other people. So it's unfortunate that we're still at a time where that's necessary. And I think we probably will be for a while, but while it is necessary, allies are the greatest thing for marginalized folks and specifically for the LGBTQ plus community in sports. It's really helpful to have someone that will just clear the way for you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me pivot back to Jeremi, and as we focus and think about, again, bringing more diversity into leadership ranks and the coaching ranks and the working in various areas, not only just within football, but within all sorts of sports leagues and organizations. Certainly, I think, we need to understand from a legal perspective, what things are on the horizon when it comes to how this may impact diversity and inclusion, right? I mean, some people point to the late Johnny Cochran as often having some credit of putting that legal pressure on there, although there was never a lawsuit necessarily filed. It was implied and threatened per se that they were going to really put a lawsuit against the NFL for the low hiring numbers of Black coaches. And so, do you foresee any legal challenges to the NFL or even other sport organizations that are currently in existence or that may possibly even be in the hopper per se that will expedite the progress further? Or even on the flip side, if there may be some legal challenges that may even deconstruct the Rooney Rule and some other diversity initiatives that are out there?
That's a great question, Darren. The legal challenge is a tough road to hoe. I mean, you pointed out that Johnny Cochran, threatened the NFL with a lawsuit, and he did. He said famously in a press conference, "If the NFL doesn't negotiate, we will litigate." Remember the way John used to talk? And but he knew that it would be tough. And I think the NFL, they've got a great general counsel over there, Jeff Pash. I think Jeff knew that it would be tough. I think the NFL was worried about the media that blew up around this, but I don't know if they're worried about the lawsuit. The reason it's so tough, Darren, is because courts are very deferential to employers' views as to what is that's something special that makes someone right for a position. And courts are even more deferential in sports because courts are afraid of sports. They don't know, they might have some idea what makes a good CEO, for IBM, but they don't know what makes a good GM or a head coach. So it's really hard as a legal matter to be successful outside of the smoking gun. So if you've got the smoking gun, you've got the email or the recorded conversation that says, yeah, no, we need, we have, too many Black coaches, we need to go another direction. Then you got a shot. Otherwise, it's really tough. It's really tough. And that's the reason why we've got these initiatives like the Rooney Rule and others that don't rely upon lawsuits, but seek to prompt or force organizations to think ahead of time about the way in which they want to build, within the organization. The other side of the coin you mentioned, I don't think, and let me say, as I say all of this, we should all know that the judiciary has grown more conservative in this country over the course of the past many years. So as pessimistic as Johnny was in his heart, probably about a lawsuit then, one would be more pessimistic now. On the other side, I don't think that the Rooney Rule initiatives like it are in great peril. The Rooney Rule is such a modest rule when you really think about it. All it says is you have to have a person of color among the final interviewees. That's it. Once that's done, you do what you want. You hire whoever you want to hire. You just have to have a person of color in the interview. Some people, very conservative quarters, argue that that's a violation of the Constitution, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I don't think so. I think it's lawful affirmative action. I think that the Rooney Rule and such initiatives are on pretty strong ground. I think lawsuits against sports organizations for discriminating probably still aren't going to be on very strong ground unless you find the smoking gun. If you find the smoking gun, and in the context we're living in now, where the expanse of systemic discrimination in this country has been made clear to everybody, then I think you'd have a shot.
Yeah, and let me follow up real quick. I wanted to kind of ask you and really think about, I think, oftentimes, we want to see more hires. We want to see an improvement in diversity, especially at coaching and GM roles. I think sometimes we don't necessarily, and I don't necessarily want to say appreciate, but we don't necessarily understand what are some of the structural conditions that make it difficult for institutions and organizations and franchises in the NFL to make these hires and to really, again, be intentional about, again, hiring diverse candidates and so forth. Like, I think there are some structural barriers to acknowledge, at least, that make it a little bit more difficult than a traditional job situation or traditional organization and employment. But what are some of those areas that we're overlooking?
Well, I think there are a few. I mean, one, I don't know if we call it a structural barrier. I think we could, and it goes to the point that Swin and LaToya made. But that a lot of stakeholders could care less. And in fact, they might want to see a particular face, on a club or an athletic department heading it up. And so in the college context, if you're talking about donors and other benefactors, in the pro context, you're talking about the suite holders, the influential fans. And so unfortunately, there are people in these roles and they have power and influence on an organization, even though they're not officially a part of it, who would prefer not to see a Black person at the helm, right? So I would say that's structural. Yep. And when talking about football in particular, one structural barrier, I spoke earlier about the history of players being kicked out of the league and slowly trickling back into certain positions. I mentioned the quarterback was last. So that's persisted. Even now, if we think about quarterbacks in the league, we have a lot of star Black quarterbacks in the league. But if you look down the depth chart at clubs and you get the second string quarterbacks, you get the folks who are fighting for a third spot, it's not diverse at all. At the lower levels, there tend not to be as many Black quarterbacks. And so it suggests that the narrative that's long existed that, hey, if we're on the margins, we're probably going to select the white candidate, I think exists in that context. And the consequence for the question, with respect to the question you asked, Darren, is so you've got fewer quarterbacks. You've historically had fewer quarterbacks. We are in a league where offense rules. Clubs are looking for offensive-minded head coaches. You have fewer Black quarterbacks who are going to become Black quarterback coaches and offensive coordinators and offensive line coaches. And so the pool is smaller if you're focusing on that offensive side, right? So that's structural. And right now, clubs seem to all, pretty much be looking on the offensive side. And another one, and the last one I'll mention, is a timing issue. So right now, we all know at the end of the NFL season, they call that, the day after the last Sunday, Black Monday. I don't like the term for a number of reasons, right? But they call it Black Monday. A bunch of coaches get fired, right? The next 2 weeks are a mad scramble to start hiring coaches up. And they move quickly. Everybody doesn't want to lose the candidate that they want. They want to get folks in the seat so they can prepare for the next season. The NFL season never really ends, right? Sam, if you're talking to folks who are with clubs, you're always working toward the next season. But the problem with that is that all the sociologists tell us that when you are forced into making a quick decision, you're going to fall back to comfort. And comfort for these ownership groups largely tend to be white men, right? And so if we found a way to change the structure, perhaps put a moratorium on head coach hiring between the end of the season and, let's say, the Super Bowl, you give folks an opportunity to be intentional, to be deliberate, to not fall back on the automatic knee-jerk reactions, and maybe expand the pool of folks that you're thinking about and become more diverse ultimately. So, I mean, we could probably go on with respect to structural barriers, but those are three that I can think of now. Yeah,
absolutely. Let me pivot back to the college area and the college world. And of course, I'm directing it to you, Dr. Smith. This past NCAA tournament, we saw on social media, and we've seen, of course, the fallout from it, the inequities that play a part when it comes to looking at the experiences of what happens in San Antonio at the women's tournament versus what's happening at the men's tournament in Indianapolis. And so the NCAA, of course, made a big fumble on this and are trying to do a job cleaning up their image when it comes to support of women's sports. But I think, again, this is not just a one-time deal. This is an indictment of how college athletics, again, continues to, neglect or not necessarily promote women's athletics on an equal footing with men's sports, right? And especially when it comes to the experience, I think of some of our even African-American women athletes, right? They've experienced some sometimes harsher criticisms, especially from media and fans, and we've seen even from our men's student athletes. So I want to talk about those different inequities and differences that we're seeing on the men's side and the women's side, and how do we continue to address that, at the intercollegiate level?
Wow, great question. I hope you also pitch this over to Swin. So.
I got something for her next.
Oh, okay. All right. So, I think, that's a really great question, and I think about the inequities, and I appreciated even just highlighting and seeing that. And I'm glad that there were opportunities to bring those to fruition, because we don't always talk about them, but we know they're there. And I think about going back to what I was saying about the non-monolithic experience and the difference between what a woman from Jamaica as a track and field athlete is going to experience an institution very differently from a Black football player from Houston. And in that, I go back to, access, exposure, as Swin mentioned earlier, like women athletes, especially Black female athletes, are there for 4 years, right? So and depending on the sport that they play, it's, really thinking about what are the next steps, and the next steps often are not professional sports. And so thinking about, how we, not only prepare them, but really help cultivate their career development, their identity development beyond just athleticism. And I think that that's one thing that often gets overshadowed, and we don't always do a great job. I think the other piece too is making sure that there's really good mentoring and providing that pipeline and that access to those career and job opportunities. When I think about our Black women, the consistently what I hear is, yes, we are with our brothers, but we have a different struggle, right? Like the intersectionality of being a Black woman, and when you try, for some of our student athletes, being Black, being a woman, being, lesbian, like the intersection of that is just, again, it's not always having the full support and the embracing of their full identity, and the ability to put a positive spotlight and the positive spotlight on what they're doing and all the great work that they're doing. Because I do feel like a lot of times there is this taxation that comes along with, being a marginalized marginalized individual, and whether it's using your voice, you know, and I struggled a lot when I was working with some of our Black women on this strong Black woman. No, I'm not gonna say myth. I think it's a stereotype. I think it's a positive one, but the damage is at what cost? The continuing swallowing of the pain, continuing swallowing. I was like, all right, I'll deal with it. I got it. You know, the cost of that from a mental standpoint, the cost of that physically, the cost of the, you know, decisions that are made, that they make, you know, that impact their self-esteem, like all of those things, I think play into that athletics has to really be thinking about as I go back to that support, right? And not having that monolithic experience and putting individuals in a box. I feel like I've rambled, but I don't know if I've quite answered your question.
No, I think we're there, and you hit
okay.
a great point where I tell my students who are in my class, you know, again, Black women athletes are very much having similar but dissimilar experiences than their Black male counterparts, but also their white female counterparts, right? And while they share similar identities in one way, again, they're still somewhat very different from both those groups, and their experiences can be quite diverging. And so building on that question, I'm gonna turn it back to Swin, and certainly Sam, you can chime in as well later, but I want to talk about equal pay. And especially when we're thinking about equal pay, WNBA, NBA, right? We recently had Draymond Green, for any of you Warriors fans out there. And I quote, all right, Draymond Green is quoted as saying about WNBA players advocating for better pay. He said, I quote, "I've seen so many complaints recently of women talking about the pay gap between and what we make and what they make. And I feel where they're coming from. I know what I put into this to be great. They put in the same time that we put in. So I understand what they're saying, but I'm really tired of seeing them complain about the lack of pay because they're doing themselves a disservice by just complaining." All right, end quote. And so in your opinion, Swin, and anybody else who wants to chime in, what is it going to take to start to improve the pay gap that we see between the WNBA and the NBA? And if the WNBAs should, quote unquote, not complain, then who should be the ones sounding off and advocating?
Well, first out, I will say, and just knowing kind of Draymond and his background to an extent, and I have to be careful here because I am not supposed to be talking about other players. I'm not commenting on his basketball or anything of that sort. But I will say that the intention of him speaking out, I thought was good. Like, I have no problem with that. I think from his position, he has watched and he's commented. You can follow him on social media talking about the game. Where he failed and where I think a lot of social media and other women were not happy with him was the fact of not doing the research and understanding what the women have done so far and what they've been asking for and the fight that's been in it, not just the complaining, but doing the work. And so that's kind of where I'm at with it, is that for so long, it's the WNBA right now, and I can tell you this, last year they did a new CBA negotiation. I shared this story, I think like 2 days ago, we were talking about the WNBA's 25th anniversary. Before I retired, 5 years before that, we had a CBA before this one. And it was one of the hardest things to write my name on that CBA because I knew that it basically was not good for us. We all knew, but we were at a point within the league that there was a lack of willingness to unify. Women were tired. They were playing 12 months like overseas and here, and it really felt like the league wasn't supporting us. So it was literally like one of those things where over half of the league was like, do whatever you want, you know, and it was about more so focusing on the money over there. And we almost lost our league because if we didn't sign that CBA, I guarantee you the WNBA would not be here right now. And so as an executive committee, we had to make a very, very difficult choice. And we decided to, yes, you know what, let's move forward. Let's get back on the call. Let's vote. Let's let everybody know we have to do this. So we did that with the intention in our mind and in our heart that the work would be done the next 5 to 6 years, that when the next CBA came up, they would be unified. And that's why they have the CBA they have now. That's why the pay has changed. And you have now $250,000 that somebody can make instead of $106,000. And so the work is being done, but we're not there yet. So some of it falls on the WNBA, but a lot of it also falls too on people getting their butts in the stands. Like, people want to tweet out something and say, oh, I support the WNBA. Have you watched the game? Have you purchased a ticket? Have you invested in these women? You have to invest where you are. I'm not saying you have to be a corporate sponsor, which we need more corporate sponsorship. But you also have to invest. Are you watching? Is your young daughter playing? Is your young son playing? Show them the NBA, show them the WNBA. Like, we have to get to that point. But we also have to hold accountable some of these corporations that are saying we want to support women, that will go and have no problem cutting a check for the U.S. women's soccer team, which I love. And a number of them met friends, love them, but they're more palatable for the U.S. than the WNBA. That's because the WNBA majority is African-American women.
Right, yep.
WNBA supports LGBTQ plus more than you're going to see coming out from the women's soccer, you know, as far as being there. And obviously, in knowing what Megan Rapinoe has done and standing and being an ally, Sue Bird, who I was college roommates with, you know, we went from college roommate of Sue Bird, not necessarily one to speak out, not in a safe space. Whereas I'm more of like, look, my mama told me when I was younger, there's 2 strikes against you. 1, you're Black, 1, you're a woman. So what? You got to get up every day and fight against it, right? I was told a different messaging than she was. So now to see her evolve to one of the most powerful voices in sports right now as a white woman who identifies with the LGBTQ community, but still fighting for me and my rights, for us to have equality. Having those allyships is so important. And I know I went in a little different way, Darren, but I wanted to just highlight the reasons why we have to do better. Yes, internally, we're doing the work, but also externally, corporations, guys that want to use their platforms, NBA guys, NFL guys, everyone that wants to use their platform. Understand what you're talking about and then support, absolutely. But you have to do the work first.
Yeah, so I do want to, turn it over to our other panelists. Again, equal pay. This is not just a basketball situation. This is not just a football. This is a everyday situation in America and the world, right? So how are we addressing this in the football world? How are we addressing this in the college sector? How are we addressing this from a legal perspective or from a legislative perspective in terms of what's going to help to really address these pay gaps?
Can I jump in on this one, Darren?
Sure.
I actually think this is where the law, there is a claim where the law really has something to say. It's, it's not the most popular opinion, but I actually think, so the pay gap is an issue, but also the WNBA and the NBA, there's tremendous gender discrimination in that NBA players can come out at the age of 19 after 1 year in college, and WNBA players is 22 and after essentially 4 years out of high school. And to me, that is a massive inequity because it bears on compensation. We all understand the net value of money, right? You have a situation where you're in college for 3 more years where you could conceivably get hurt and lose the opportunity to make money as a professional. So you're not able to benefit off your endorsements. You're not able to go and play in Europe. There are all sorts of things that you're unable to do. And so I think that there is a Title VII gender discrimination claim that can be brought against the NBA, because the WNBA is a partially owned subsidiary, and basically you have 2 divisions of basketball, one for men where you've got a lower barrier to entry, and one for women where you have a higher barrier to entry. So I think that if a woman in college wanted to come and challenge the eligibility rule like Maurice Claret did with the NFL some years ago, that woman would have a legitimate chance under Title VII to be successful and invalidate the discrepancy between the age eligibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, I think you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I just think Swin's point about the way the country reacted to the U.S. soccer team versus the WNBA is such a poignant point and something that we really need to pay attention to. And, it really is incumbent on the quote unquote dominant groups, right? Men and white people, because they can fix this, right? And so if you look at pay equity among women alone, white women are paid the most among women if you compare that to Black women, Native American women, Asian women, and Latinx women, right? And so what am I doing as a white woman who's getting paid the most out of a white women group? And what are men doing to help narrow this pay equity, right? Men are in power. Men run ESPN. Men run, how we watch sports. So men with women could collectively come together and say, this problem needs to be fixed. And how do we fix it? Let's get women's sports on television. Let's fix the pay equity problem. And so, my wish and vision for the future is that people would latch on to, important efforts that may not affect them personally, but affects the greater good and what we're all trying to fight for. So So of course I'm passionate about LGBTQ plus and women's rights, but I'm even more passionate specifically about Black women's efforts in corporate America. And that's my personal passion. And I am not a Black woman. And I really wish that more people would attach themselves who have power to change things for other marginalized groups. And then these pay equity problems, all of this female in sports equity problems would just progressively get better if we all put our hands together and did that.
Man, Sam, thank you for sharing that. And thank you, panelists. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. So folks, if you have been tuning in and you haven't asked your question, please go ahead and drop it in the Q&A. We can't promise you we'll get to all the questions, but we're going to try to get to a few during our time here during Q&A until we have to wrap up in about 20 minutes. So I do see a question right now that I want to answer live. It's from Heidi Simmons. And so she asked to the panelists, for any panelists that are able to share, what has been one of the most challenging situations you've dealt with professionally in the arena of DE&I that didn't reach a positive resolution, and how did it impact your future decisions and your work? How are you able to remain positive in your own work as well? The challenging situation that you dealt with when you're advocating for diversity, something that didn't happen, nothing positive came about from it, and how do you persevere? How do you get through?
I will just have a quick one. A situation happened before I actually took this job, where I felt that I was qualified for a certain position. I won't say where. I was qualified for a certain position. Instead of even interviewing me, the position was given to, he interviewed a white male. And then I was given a position or offered a position outside of sports, but more because of the business acumen to work on the business side for this company, but to still bring all of myself, but to not be given the title or to be given that position. And so I had a choice to make of either you take this position or you walk away from it. And they were highly surprised that I was like, thank you, but no thank you. And it was the first time that I've ever felt that. You fight against, you advocate in different spaces, but that was the first time that it directly kind of happened to me and I saw it happen. And it made me feel really good, damn good actually, to be in a position where I was able to walk away, but most women aren't, they aren't. And after almost a year being out of that position, and I got a call, and the call was like, well, you think you would ever come back if that position opened up again? I was like, probably not. I don't know, but you always keep you always keep things open. But it was very, really interesting that the people that were coming in who were also minorities felt that it was better to have this gentleman who had less experience than I did. I felt at least I should have been given an interview and was not given that.
Yeah. Excellent answer. I have another question from Sierra Crow. She asked for the women on the panel, how do you continue pushing past the gender discrimination within the sports industry coming from every direction? She says, I'm still a student, but I have already been asked multiple times how I think I could succeed as a woman in sports. So again, how do you continue to deal with this? And again, even from a student's perspective, she's already getting these questions before she's even going into this. So, what advice can you give to some of our aspiring women students who are really, are passionate about sports and want to go through this, but obviously you're having to deal with gender discrimination from all angles, it seems.
I'll jump in, and I'm actually going to give kudos to Sam because I love the linebacker analogy. Is that what it was? Was it a linebacker?
Lead blocker.
Oh, my bad. Lead blocker. My bad. But I think how I interpret that is, as Sam said, is having those allies. And I have found that sometimes my biggest allies have been men who have, opened the door and said, hey, and given me a shot. But I've been able to establish really great relationships where I can push back and say, you know what, that's not okay. Or, hey, have you thought about this? Or have you thought about the impact it's having on women or, Blacks or Asian, other groups. And so I would definitely recommend finding really strong allies that are willing to sacrifice for you. I think that's really important. People say, oh, I'm an ally, but are they willing to sacrifice? Are they willing for them to lose so that you can gain? I think the other thing too is I have found having solidarity and working with other women. Whenever I can find, and I call them, my personal board of directors, when I can find women, and they don't always have to be women, but when I have found women who really are invested in helping my career, but also helping me become the best professional I can be and the best person I can be, I really hold on to those women and continue to cultivate relations with them, because part of it is being able to navigate. And, we talk a lot in DDCE about the unwritten curriculum. And so that would be my advice for students, is really getting with someone who has been there, who can help you understand how to navigate that unwritten curriculum and breaking down those walls and those obstacles with gender discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Sam, you going to jump in? Or?
Yeah, no, I thought, LaToya, that was such a good point. And I think, Sierra, it'll be hard, and you can do hard, right? Like it's not going to put you in the doctor's office. You're not going to be in the hospital. You're going to take hits. It's like, what Swin probably dealt with for her whole playing career. You take hits, you get back up, you take hits, you get back up, and you can do it. Right. And we've done it, and we're trying to blaze a path so it's a little bit easier for the next generation. And there are a lot of male champions, two of whom are on this call, who are trying to change the culture as well to make it easier and more inclusive. But I was fortunate enough last season to meet Billie Jean King for the first time, and I kind of lost my mind. But one thing she told me when I was talking to her about the challenges is she walked away, and then she came back. She said, don't forget, like, they're not in the ring, you're in the ring. And anytime you hear criticisms or negativity or whoever told you may not belong, they're not in the ring, you're in the ring. So you got to stay in the ring with your gloves on and keep fighting. And we're all working to make it a little bit easier for you.
I have another question from Sam Turner, and they asked, though activism has always been intertwined with sport, there is a persistent shut up and dribble sentiment amongst certain circles. How should teams, leagues, and schools handle or support players and coaches who are expressing their political and social opinions both on and off the field?
I'm happy to start. This was a proud year last year was a proud year actually for me personally at the NFL, because it was really the first time I felt that we gave the players a true voice and we stood behind what they said as it pertained to certain issues that were important to them. And I think, sports has always kind of toiled the line there and kind of been comfortable in the gray area. And I'm certainly not saying we're perfect. We have a lot of improvement to do, but there were points this year where I felt prouder that there were opportunities, that our players felt heard, that they felt like they have a voice, and that is absolutely the way that it should be, in my humble opinion. I know the NBA, and I'm curious, Swin's opinion and everyone else as well, but I think that's something that has been interesting and enlightening to me this year, and I hope we continue to, open that door for the people who make us the money to be the ones that are highlighted, and we highlight things that they care about and are important to them.
Sure.
Yeah, I think from a professional level, I think just being in the NBA, I think our leadership has always been, I think, very forward facing when it comes to everything that has to deal with, whether it's equality, whether it's diversity. The NBA has always been progressive in that way to me. Being in the WNBA, there's always hiccups, I think, along the road, but I think having the ability to work with the union, I think the NBPA, the relationship with the NBPA and the NBA and the WNBPA, that is where a lot of these deals about what needs to be, made, what type of programming needs to be done for ex-players, current players, just giving them the ability to feel heard, I think is one of the things that Adam Silver and Michelle Roberts have really kind of leaned into. And also Terry, also with the Women's Association. I think when you talk about colleges, that's where it gets tricky, because pros, at the end of the day, they're going to look at the bottom line. And in sports, like, if you aren't, I think, being more progressive right now, if you aren't leaning into social justice issues, people are calling you out, and social media is making that something that really just hits at the bottom line. And so anybody that's a smart business person, they're going to look at that and understand, all right, where do we need to be better and how do we get more resources? That's just me. That's my opinion. Whether it's good intentions or not, you still get the same results because the players want to see these things happening. I think for colleges and universities, the issue is it goes back to their alumni, like who's cutting the check. I think LaToya talked about it earlier. Sometimes people are scared to make decisions or to invest in certain resources because they're worried about where the money's coming from, where's the endowments coming from. And so it's hard because students, especially Gen X, they are very smart. They are watching what's happening. They are live, they are on fire, and they want to see change. And so they're even different from my generation. And I love it. But now, and I think leadership has to figure out of, you have a new age kind of way of thinking in mind of these young people. And so how do we try to continue to help them mature, but give them the resources to still fly? And I think that's where the ones who are doing it right are succeeding, and the ones who aren't, you see them, you can tell when people of color are not in the room, and some of these statements that come out from universities or from teams. That's where you have to start making the change, is making sure your leadership is diverse enough to meet these situations whenever they come about.
You know, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, for some, you know, back in the 1960s, there was very little divergence between sport and political activism. I mean, sport was political activism, and really there's no reason why you should separate sport and society in that way. But in the decades that followed, that's what we got. There wasn't a whole lot of political activism in sport. And so it's just recently that we've seen it come back, and there's a sense, no, you should shut up and dribble, because that's how it was done for the last 3 decades. Well, before that, it wasn't done that way. I think at the end of the day, and Swin is right, there's a bottom line there. At the end of the day, all of us, you know, our kids are going to look back, our grandkids are going to look back on what we did back in 2020. They're going to read about what happened in history books. They're going to say, what did my grandparents do, right? And I think it's the same way with organizations. I mean, are you going to be on the right side of history or not? And so there are times when you have to do something that's going to cut off some of your fans. What Major League Baseball did in moving their All-Star game, that's a big deal in Major League Baseball. Look at the demographic of their fans, right? By moving out of Atlanta because of what's going on there with the legislation that's attacking voting rights, they took a stand, and they are going to lose more money than make money off that stand, I believe. But at some point, we have to put our foot in the ground.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, Jeremi, because I knew we have another question related to a major issue that's happening, I think, politically across a lot of our states when it comes to legislation that's being proposed and even passed in some instances about transgender athletes, right? I mean, so the intent, and how do we feel about the increasing attention to transgender athletes, and how is it reaffirming stereotypes about female athletes, and how can we advocate better for transgender athletes while also kind of really interrogating some of these different ideas of these traditional ideas of femininity that marginalize women?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think everyone probably knows where I stand on trans inclusion in sports, but I think that the country has a long way to go for trans acceptance. You know, in the gay community for a long time, and erroneously, when we were pitching for legislation as far as marriage equality and what have you, we dropped the T out of LGBTQ+ because we felt like the country was so not ready to talk about transgender, but they would approve marriage equality if we left them out. And there was a lot of controversy around that about 10, 15 years ago. And so, you know, that's how far this country is from, you know, its own community, right? The LGBTQ+ community didn't even include them in that effort. So we have a long way to go for trans inclusion in this country. And I think it starts with everyone who is not in the LGBTQ+ community to really educate themselves on what it is and what it means, and to not question their validity or what they're saying, or, you know, and if you have those questions, to educate yourself instead of positing, you know, and going on a diatribe about how that's not the case. And, you know, being trans is real. It is an extremely challenging life to live. 40% of trans kids try to attempt suicide. That is a staggering statistic. And so they just want to play damn sports, right? And so they want to play sports in the gender that they're supposed to play sports in. And I think you know, one of the challenges is there's always this like monster in the room of what happens if we allow something as it pertains to the transgender community. But to this date, there has never been an incident in a bathroom with a transgender person just trying to use the restroom. There has never been. But that's the number one thing that we hear from the community as it pertains to, well, what about the bathroom, right? The slippery slope argument is dangerous, and it's not a valid argument. And you know, I just hope that people educate themselves on the challenges and have empathy instead of going to anger or trying to exclude them from just them trying to live their lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Sam said, is that the work continues. It has to be done. The education piece is huge. And I think when we can start getting more of that education in our institutions, then as they're getting older and we're talking about situations that have happened in the Olympics, right? And that comes every 4 years. But this is happening all the time on so many teams, travel teams, this, that, the other. There has to be more education in order to make people understand it's not, the situation with the bathroom, but how can we be inclusive in all of our sports for transgender, individuals. And I think the more we educate ourselves, the more we have those conversations and bring people in, the more we have, whether it's Zoom calls, whether it's bringing people in to educate our young people. Sometimes our young people are educating us. And I think that's where we have to be at in order for real change to happen.
Yeah. Quick time check. We have about 7 more minutes. We're going to try to get to maybe one more question, and then also give our panelists just a time to give a parting shot in terms of where we go from here. But quick 30 seconds each. So let me go ahead and address this question from Devin. What specific DE&I initiatives have you experienced or heard about that have really been shown to be effective and should be encouraged to be adopted? So maybe it's programs, maybe it's initiatives, maybe it's some kind of practices or policies that have been created either in your organizations or that you've witnessed from other organizations. What do you think has been effective, and what would you like to either be adopted maybe in yours if it's not there, or maybe translate or move over to other organizations?
Darren, let me tackle this one. And what I'm going to say is what I hope will be adopted at other institutions. One of the things that have come out of this summer and some of the initiatives at our university is really empowering, in particular, our student athletes and some of the funds that come out of athletics to be directed into community sponsorships and creating these, grants to improve the lives of and improve their communities where they're coming from, but empowering student athletes to make those decisions, right? So not only educating them about philanthropy and how, and how to use the money, but creating a vehicle for them to then go back and say, based on, my experience with these different community partnerships and sponsorships, let me provide this money or make a decision to put back money into this community. And, in some ways, I think that's another way in which student athletes can use their name, image, and likeness and that platform to really make social change in various communities. So that's something I hope that as we continue to adopt at our university and really see where this goes, that's a DEI initiative that can really make some substantial and some transformative change and really reallocating those funds to communities.
That's great. And something we do that I'd like to share, because we share this with corporations and others, is, if you host a gender diversity program, the number one beneficiary of that will be white women, unless you intentionally organize it for it not to be. And, if you look at affirmative action research, the number one beneficiary of affirmative action is white women. And so the reason that white women are the beneficiaries of all these programming is because white men are in power. And if they are going to let or allow the door to open, white women are the people with whom they feel the most comfortable. And so I look like their daughter, I look like their niece, their wife, whatever you want to call it. And so what we did is we mandated that white women were the minority. And so what we tried to do is equal the playing field. And so this year, 75% of our participants were women of color, with an emphasis on Black women, because we have an emphasis on Black talent because of what Jeremi was speaking about, with 75% of our players being Black. And the result of that is I hope that all of you have seen, is we've seen the first Black female coach, the first Black female scout, first Black female chief of staff, and it keeps happening because there's an intentionality. So to answer the question directly, if you don't have an intentionality behind intersectionality and really including all, if we use gender as an example, white women are going to be the beneficiaries, they're going to be the ones that get the job, and they're going to be the ones that get paid the most.
Appreciate it, Sam. We're coming up on time. So again, I want to give our panelists just one opportunity to, again, to bless the mic and just let us know, hey, how do we continue this work? Where do we go from here? How do we move forward in the sports industry? And how do we continue to really progress and move diversity and equity and inclusion in the right direction? So I want to go ahead and start it off with Swin, and then I'll direct it to others. And you guys have about 30 seconds or so just to really kind of say, hey, how do we go from here?
Yeah, I think as a young African-American girl coming out of McKee Sports right outside of Pittsburgh, I've seen things happen like the Rooney Rule and be super excited about it because I understood what it can mean down the road. And I want to use that as an example of where do we go from here? We have to be intentional whenever we have situations or legislation that's passed, or we have rules in the NBA, NFL, with the New Orleans Pelicans. We institute these kind of rules like the Rooney. We have to be intentional about making sure people can't find ways to poke holes and get around those type of rules that will make it easier for people that look like me to get jobs and opportunities. Because people are always going to figure out a way how I can get around the rule. But moving forward, we have to be very intentional about how we're advocating, how we're setting and being very conscious about the fact that Black and brown people are not given a fair shot, whether it's in sports, whether it's in corporate America. And until we are intentional, and until white America also understands that they have to play a significant role in it, we're not going to be able to get anything done. So I'm going to be intentional. And my challenge to all the young people that are on here today is be intentional about whatever it is that you want to do, but always remember to help the people that are coming behind you.
LaToya, 30 seconds.
I love this African proverb, and I think it speaks to what we're doing. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And I think going back and piggybacking off what Swin as well as Sam has said, it's about not only intentionality, but doing it together in solidarity. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, LaToya. Sam.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes from Dr. Imani Perry, who I've studied, said, she was speaking to the room and started off by saying, can we all admit that we are not innocent? And, I'm really passionate about, white people taking on the task of fixing this. And I think the first step from my experience in speaking to a lot of white people in our office and in sports is admitting that we are not innocent and that we are complicit. And then what are we going to do with that complicity? And I think if we can all get to that point, then we can start to make changes and move away from the I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, I'm not homophobic. And a lot of time when I start talks, I talk about I am racist. Of course I'm racist. I was given some of the most, the worst imagery of Black America when I was growing up, right? Those images are portrayed in your mind. And so if people sometimes say, well, if you are, then I guess I am too. Let's look deep into that. And then what are you going to do with your privilege to fix it? Because we can fix it. People in power have the power to fix this.
All right, thank you, Sam. Last but not least, Jeremi.
Well, I'll say, first of all, those are three pearls of wisdom. All three of those, with Swin and Sam and LaToya, all of those things are things that I take to heart. I guess the thing that I'd say, Swin mentioned earlier, that it really is, it's almost faddish to be concerned about these issues right now on the individual and corporate level about systemic discrimination. But how about a year from now, and 2 and 3 years from now, when 2020, 21 starts to fade, are we still going to be committed? So what I guess I'd say is, make it, a movement and not a moment. Stick with it, stick with this fight. If we lay off this fight in a couple of years, we are not going to have success in 10. So stick with it, keep chopping. I don't know if this is something that gets solved in any of our lifetimes, but I think we should commit our lifetimes to trying to solve.
All right, thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to all of our panelists. Wow, I'm incredibly impressed with the presence that we have today and the folks that really just were able to really drop knowledge and dimes on us to really understand what issues we face within diversity, equity, inclusion. Thank you all so much. I want to give thanks to Swin Cash-Canal, Sam Rapoport, Dr. LaToya Smith, Jeremi Duru. Thank you so much for taking your time and being with us today, sharing your thoughts with our audience. Again, I apologize if we weren't able to get to all the questions, and I really appreciate the audience being so engaged and asking questions. Thank you all so much for attending. Please stick with us as we transition to our next panel. I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Rizurtsu and the rest of the long game team that'll help transition us to our next panel. Thank you all so much.